sure that everyone watching this from my history class knows the spirit this is made in, but for the rest of the people who have found this video, I feel like I need a disclaimer, because, ranking religions doesn't really sound like a good thing to do. To make things clear, I'm just going to be ranking the different branches of Protestantism from a purely historical context. I want to say that if you are a believer of any of the branches that I rank as low tier, I hope that you have interpreted the theology of your religion in a way that makes the world a better place and leads you to be a good person. Because every religion is terrible if you listen to every aspect of it. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's lay down some methodology for how I'm going to be ranking the different branches of Protestantism. Like I said, I'm going to be working from a historical perspective, and I'm going to stop considering any doctrine introduced after around 1700, meaning if there's some terrible idea, Southern Baptists, that is firmly part of history, Southern Baptists, but is after 1700, it won't affect their ranking. That also means there won't be any of the Great Awakening religions in this. I'm also going to try to limit this to the major branches of Protestantism. I also won't be ranking any of the Proto-Reformation religions or pre-Reformation heresies. And I'm going to ignore all of the continental Reformed churches, because while they were usually theologically similar to Calvinism, exact theological minutiae varies from country to country, as they're all descended from the specific Reformation movement in their country, and that's just way too many. Now, the main principle I will be ranking the branches on will be how good they were at fixing any of the problems present in Catholicism at the time and the spirit in which they were founded. Points will also be rewarded for theological consistency, especially when it comes to actually following the first two commandments. And how much did they permit personal interpretation of the Bible and open discussion? While this won't be expected for a solid, acceptable ranking, things like women's rights and how tolerant they were towards other religions are a good way for a branch to raise its score. Other than that, I'll just try to give you a good overview of the religion, especially in how each branch of Protestantism differed from the others. Because if there's one defining trait for Christians historically, it's their inability to play nice with people who have different theological opinions. Obviously, we have to start with the OG Protestantism, Lutheranism. But first, we're going to have to go over what was wrong with the Catholic Church in the early 1500s. The clergy had always been corrupt, full of simony and lechery. With all the power held by the Pope, high-ranking priests were less holy men and more like politicians. The Renaissance was the height of this, with many of their popes making my favorite Wikipedia article, the list of sexually active popes. Clergy had long kept the contents of the scriptures secret from the common people. They were only written in Latin, so only the educated could read them. Catholicism was very clear about how the Bible should be interpreted, and would excommunicate whoever disagreed. Another big problem were indulgences, the microtransactions of salvation. You pay, the church pockets the money, and your sins are absolved. With all this, it's natural that in 1517, Martin Luther went, well, you know.
It's bullshit. This whole thing is bullshit. That's a scam. Fuck the church. Here's 95 Reasons Why, said Martin Luther in his new book, which might have accidentally started the Protestant Reformation.
Luther didn't want to make a new religion. He wanted to improve Catholicism, which is why the religion that sprang up from his teachings was very similar to Catholicism liturgy-wise. There is a church hierarchy, but it caps at bishop. More importantly, no mortal is infallible. Martin Luther's work to translate the Bible into German and a new printing presses, ability to distribute it, led to a valuing of literacy that would apply to all Protestant traditions. While the interpretation of the Bible, within reason, was encouraged, only Scripture, rather than canon law, had any holy weight to it. The last big through line for all of Protestantism was that salvation could come only through faith in God. Now this was supposed to excuse someone from having to do something like pay indulgences or make pilgrimages, but supposedly this could let someone get into heaven without them having to do any good deeds. The rebuttal is that to actually believe in Jesus, that person would have to do good. Salvation comes from God's mercy alone, not anything a pope or a priest can deal out. All in all, it was about stripping away the barriers Catholicism put between the common person and God. Lutheranism was basically the generic Protestantism, although it wouldn't end up being the most successful. It's pretty similar to Catholicism, but addresses the flaws of the church, which is why it gets an acceptable B ranking. There were other minor theological issues that Lutheranism changed from Catholicism and other Protestant branches differed from Luther on. But in addition to barely understanding them, it's not really that important how literally any one branch took the Eucharist compared to others. And now for John Calvin, my arch nemesis. You had some incredibly terrible takes. But first we should start with the good stuff. Calvinism takes all the stuff from Lutheranism and adds in iconoclasm. While iconoclasts have a bad habit of violently destroying artwork, unlike Catholics, they actually remember the second commandment. This is the kind of theological consistency I'm talking about. It is Calvinism that really took Europe by storm and became each respective country's continental reform movement. Each tradition had different levels of fidelity to Calvin's original terrible ideas, but they all sprang from the same philosophical well. During the 30 Years' War, the Protestant side was mostly made up of each region's brand of Calvinism. So, what are these terrible ideas I keep talking about? Calvinism is a very depressing religion. I don't really understand how something so fatalistic caught on. Rather than the original sin just causing someone to be born in the negative, it caused humanity to become totally depraved. Human nature is inherently evil, and not only that, but God has already chosen who will get into heaven, and that nothing a person on earth does can change that ruling. It's heavy on predestination. Humans are so corrupted that they cannot even choose to believe in Jesus by their own free will. Those who are following the correct faith are doing so only because they are fated, and to hell with all the rest. Literally. And why? What purpose does a philosophy like this serve? The proponents of religion in general argue that it gets people to do good and provides people with hope. But Calvinism, humans are terrible and there is nothing anyone can do about it. For a historical note, somehow among all this fatalism, it was Dutch Calvinists allied with Sephardic Jews who rebelled against Spain and founded the Netherlands. This began the Netherlands' history as a hub of religious and philosophical freedom. All religious minorities were granted asylum in the Netherlands, and philosophers who feared religious persecution in their home countries came to the Netherlands. The Dutch allowed books banned by other religious authorities to be printed and distributed. But as I said at the beginning, this is a ranking of the principles of each religion, not about how their followers interpreted it. So it is not this uncharacteristic tolerance that allows Calvinism to scrape by with a D ranking. In addition to the iconoclasm, it is the fact that they at least made an effort to make the world a better place. Next, Presbyterians. Presbyterianism, in its strict sense, is a type of continental Reformed church. Those are the ones that I said were too small and varied to actually count. Now, if a church actually has Presbyterian in the name, it probably originated in Scotland. Any of those are usually theologically Calvinist, which has already knocked off so many points. The cool thing about them is the Presbyterian form of church government. In that you have councils of church elders who are elected laymen serving a term. A lot of churches can group together and have area-wide councils for more important problems. This achieved one of the Reformation's goals of breaking down the division between clergy and lay people. Early on, Presbyterians also didn't build any fancy churches. The buildings were simply meeting houses, further putting the emphasis on the worshippers rather than the location. These two aspects allow Presbyterianism to move beyond its Calvinist theology and get a C ranking. And now for Arminianism. Calvinism new and improved. Jacob Arminius, for which the religion is named, looked at Calvinism and decided to scrap the strict predestination that made me give it such a bad ranking. It kept the idea of total depravity, but that is so close to Catholicism's original sin, I can't begrudge it too much. It allows free will to coexist with an all-powerful God. although it can vary throughout time and location in the extent of determinism versus predestination it allowed. Under Arminianism, humans can accept or deny God's salvation, and although not free from their sinful nature, they can choose to do good. That is enough to push it up to a high B ranking. While it is still iconoclastic, that simply isn't enough for it to get a higher tier than Lutheranism, because it still holds many of the depressing trappings of its original religion. The Anabaptists. The Anabaptists were founded on one defining principle, that infants cannot consent to becoming Christians. The Anna in their name comes from again, but that wasn't what they called themselves. They saw the baptisms of infants as non-binding, so rather than being baptized again upon reaching adulthood or conversion, that baptism was the first time. But obviously outsiders saw it as a second baptism. This is such a cool idea. So many people only follow a certain religion because that's what their parents did. If that's the case, can you really say that they chose it of their own free will? Now, of course, the Anabaptists would still raise their children in line with their own religious beliefs, but each of them still had to choose of their own free will to accept Christianity. The Anabaptists were also part of the radical Reformation. Contrary to what one might assume, the Reformation actually decreased the little bit of separation of church and state that existed before. In Catholicism, the church had its own courts and a pope who could define what was heretical, and invested a king with his divine right to rule. But once a lord embraced Protestantism, there wasn't anyone who could check his allegedly God-given right to rule. Lutherans and Calvinists practiced something known as magisterial reformation, where the duties that previously belonged to the ecclesiastical courts, such as dealing with heretics, became the duties of secular lawmen. The radical Reformation rejected any secular relationship with church business. Anabaptists were even banned from holding magisterial positions. They also rejected the idea of a church hierarchy altogether, instead defining the church as a small community of believers. Anabaptists were the most prominent radical Reformation group. In addition, they believed in free will and felt that everyone could do whatever they wanted religion-wise. One questionable thing about the Anabaptists were their doctrine about complete nonviolence, preventing themselves from even defending themselves against their own persecution. They also practiced nonconformity to the world, refusing to accept any secular authority. This same insistence about clearly defining themselves also led to their doctrine of simple living. A reoccurring thing throughout religious reformation is that the only choices are greedy decadence that harms others and no fun allowed modesty. The Anabaptists practiced the latter, but they weren't aggressively enforcing it on others. As you'd expect, because of their denial of secular authorities and pacifism, governments really hated the Anabaptists. They were frequently persecuted and weren't even counted as a protected group in the Treaty of Westphalia, which ensured that Christians wouldn't persecute other Christians in continental Europe. The Anabaptists have since died out, but their descendants are groups like the Mennonites and the Amish. Despite their banning of luxury and pacifism in the face of injustice, I feel the Anabaptists go above and beyond when it comes to theological consistency. Believer baptisms are just such a cool idea, as is the extreme separation of church and state. I just really like their theology, and the kind of denial of technology that the Amish practice today couldn't really be a thing in their era, so they didn't suffer its detriments. Because of this, they get an S ranking, the highest possible. And now for Baptists, or as I like to call them, Anabaptists Light. It is debated if they were inspired by Anabaptists, or if their founders, English dissenters, we'll talk more about them later, came to the same conclusion independently. The unifying principle of Baptists was again baptism of believers only. They were congregational in government, so each individual congregation would have their own idea about how things were done from the get-go. Some early Baptists wanted freedom of religion and a separation of church and state, but they weren't as extreme as the Anabaptists when it came to differentiating their communities. In the centuries to come, this chillness would oftentimes give way to mission work and some other terrible ideas, but like I said at the beginning, I won't be talking about those. While they don't have the theological consistency of the Anabaptists, believer baptisms, congregationalism, and, at their beginning, wanting religion to be kept out of laws altogether, is enough to easily secure them an A ranking. Meaning they're pretty cool, but they don't go far beyond what you'd expect of people from the 17th century. And now for the Church of England. Time is going to be less of an overview of various doctrines and more of a story. In 1531, known thick boy and King of England Henry VIII asked Pope Clement VII for a dispensation to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, on the grounds of incest, since her first husband was Henry's dead brother. In reality, Henry wanted to get rid of Catherine, since she had yet to bear him a male heir. But there was a problem. Catherine's nephew was Emperor Charles V, ruling both Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. He was the most powerful man in Europe. To make matters even worse, Clement VII was the prisoner of Charles after the sack of Rome. Catholicism wasn't doing too great, so there was no way he could give the dispensation. So Henry looked around at all these people splitting from the church in Rome and went, "Hey, I can do that too!" Theologically, he was opposed to all the principles of the Reformation, but dealing with his great matter was more important. So he created the Church of England and appointed himself the head, with the Archbishop of Canterbury doing most of the actual pope work. Other than that, the Church of England was exactly the same as Catholicism. Henry got his divorce and a new marriage, but once you've pulled that bandage off, you end up going through 6 wives before you realize. Under Henry's rule, there was one other change to the Church of England. Oh, something in line with the ideals of the Reformation? Nope! It was all about getting more power for himself. He disbanded all the monasteries and similar organizations just so he could seize all their land and money. While Henry's successors would introduce and permit reforms to make Catholicism more similar to other Protestant branches, it would always remain a middle ground between Protestantism and Catholicism. But that doesn't matter. I'm not considering how the religion evolved, but the spirit in which it was created, and the spirit of the Church of England is pure selfish consolidation of power. So it gets an F ranking. Henry didn't even make an effort. Despite their similarities, England ended up trapped in a Protestant Catholic oppression flip-flop for centuries, with whoever didn't support the current ruler's religion suffering. Because of England's rejection of the Pope, without any of the other reforms that came with Protestantism, a lot of theologians in England went on to found their own religions. While Puritans weren't strictly defined and didn't self-identify as such, it was a term given to those who wanted to purify the Church of England of its Catholic roots, especially the extremists. Oh, and they were most influenced by the philosophy of Calvinism. They were pretty big jerks in this purification. After the English Civil War and King Charles I getting his head chopped off, Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, read Dictator, of England. Puritans believed that it was the job of the government to enforce the true religion. They were a no-fun religion without any of the cool stuff of the Quakers or the Anabaptists. Those 2 factors led to them banning everything considered sinful, including but not limited to theater, gambling, mixed-gender dances, and even Christmas. They were also big on witch hunts, mostly as a way to get rid of inconvenient women. The witch hunts of England and America were led by Puritans. Eventually, everyone got fed up with all this. The Restoration happened, and Charles II was put back on the throne. After that, Puritanism faded away, but before the English Civil War, many Puritans left for New England because they were too annoyed about all the other non-Puritans around them, and the feeling was mutual. So the Puritans went off to be jerks and ocean away. This same hegemony in the New World would eventually fade as well, but that's why pilgrims wear those funny hats. Before I started doing research, I knew a bit about Puritans and Oliver Cromwell, but I didn't realize that they were basically Calvinists but worse. I didn't think you could be worse at theology than Calvinists. The only reason Puritans don't get an F ranking is because they at least made an effort. It's better to honestly believe in something terrible than to believe in nothing. So they get an E ranking, all alone where they can't bother anyone else. If the Puritans were the worst example of English dissenters, then the Quakers were the best. They called themselves the Religious Society of Friends and their members Friends. They had the same simple living, pacifism, and priesthood of believers as the Anabaptists. Quakers would break themselves off into different congregations that would follow different charismatic preachers or just separate into different meetings that agreed on issues of doctrine. As a unifying thread, they all believed in free will, social justice, personal relationship with God, and an idea called the light within, that everyone has the light of God inside them and they just need to access it. The Quakers were most unprecedented in their acceptance of female preachers. The Friends were the only branch of Protestantism that led to more social power and rights for women. They even had the public universal friend, a preacher who was assigned female at birth, but claimed to be born with a new genderless spirit, and their followers would gender them as such. Eventually, the Quakers would come to be known for their fierce abolitionism, but it would take until the American Revolution for all the various meetings to come to that consensus. Just like the Anabaptists, the Quakers went above and beyond when it came to religious integrity. They properly represent the ideals of the Reformation and have some pretty cool theological principles. So, they get an S ranking. Now, Congregationalism is more of a movement than any single denomination. Many Puritans and other English dissenters had a Congregationalist form of church government. As I've defined before, Congregationalism has each congregation completely responsible for its own affairs. It doesn't even have the tiered councils of Presbyterianism. Because each church is completely independent, each one can vary between having very good ideas and having very bad ideas. But you can't have any of the problems of organized religion if you don't organize your religion. The Congregationalist movement is the exact opposite of the Catholic Church, a Christendom-wide unified church with its own hierarchy. One can say that that Congregationalism embodies the spirit of the Protestant Reformation. It certainly is symptomatic of the newfound variety that made researching this video so hard. Because of that, I'm giving them an A. The only reason they don't get an S is because they don't have any concrete principles I can look at and say, hey, that's really cool. When I came up with the idea for this project, I went, well, at least I won't have to try to understand Trinitarianism, because they figured that out centuries ago. Boy, was I wrong! Our last movement is Unitarianism. There is some debate about whether Unitarianism constitutes part of Protestantism, since they seem to break from one of the unifying principles of Protestantism, the Trinity. But Unitarianism came from the Reformation as well, so I'm counting it. Now, what is the Trinity, you may ask? Honestly, I have no idea, and I have a suspicion that Christians don't know either. But whatever it is, Unitarians don't believe in it. Rather than Jesus being an aspect of God or something, he is just the best prophet, TM. This actually brings Unitarianism more in line with Judaism and Islam. I've read good arguments that Christianity is tritheistic rather than monotheistic. The Unitarians agreed with those, and so they decided to be certain that they followed "you shall have no other gods." Again, good theological consistency. There are variations of Unitarianism with different beliefs about the relationship between Jesus and God, but I don't have any idea what any of it means. Unitarianism rejects other pieces of standard Christian doctrine. Their full determinism / free will. There isn't even an original sin marring every person's soul. And more surprisingly, they assert that the authors of the Bible were inspired by God, but they were still human, so the text of the Bible they had may be twisted or incorrectly recorded. Later on, they would even reject the idea of eternal damnation. Unitarian theology was the theology that I personally found the most appealing. However, without a foundation of social justice, the Unitarian reputation for liberalism would come later. I can't really put them in S tier, so it'll have to stick with the upper end of A tier. So, those are the main branches of Protestantism. This is what happens when you can't share a service with someone who disagrees with you theologically. I hope I was able to accurately explain the kind of theological topics that people sometimes study for years to understand. And while I encourage discussion in the comments, I want people to keep in mind that while those discussions should be as dispersonal as a good-natured debate about which army had the best cavalry units, we also need to remember that religion is a lot more important to people than something like if the winged hussars are better than the Mongols or not.
Two ways to view the world, so similar at times. two ways to rule the world, to justify their crimes. By kings and queens, young men are sent to die in war. Their propaganda speaks those words been heard